The air in the office of the CEO of Mulroney Advertising was heavy, saturated with the artificial scent of eucalyptus coming from the expensive diffuser on the ebony desk. The LED lights embedded in the ceiling cast a cold glow on the impeccably vacuumed navy blue carpet, while the panoramic windows displayed the skyline of Raleigh, North Carolina, in shades of grey and gold at dusk. It was a place of power, a sanctuary for Daniel Mulroney, the 38-year-old millionaire CEO who ran the region's most influential advertising company with iron fists and a cutting smile. That day, he would arrive home from a meeting in Charlotte, exhausted but relentless, expecting to find his office spotless for a moment of peace before another corporate battle. But fate had other plans. The door to the private bathroom creaked open, a sharp sound that cut through the silence like a knife. Daniel entered, his Italian shoes echoing on the black marble floor, his dark blue Armani suit fitted to his athletic body, his brown hair combed with military precision. His green eyes, sharp as blades, swept the room and stopped. There she was. Grace Simons, his 26-year-old assistant, an unlikely figure in that scene of obscene luxury. She was sprawled on the toilet, the cold seat supporting her exhausted body. Her grey company uniform, a cheap blouse and a faded pencil skirt, was rumpled, the sleeves rolled up to reveal skinny arms marked by veins that showed sleepless nights. Her brown hair, normally tied up in a tight bun, fell in messy strands over her pale face, and a low, almost pathetic snore escaped from her ajar mouth. Around her the floor was covered in crumpled papers, reports, notes, campaign drafts. A chaos that told a story of desperation. Daniel stood still, his jaw clenched, his fists clenched at his sides. The scene was an insult, an affront to his authority. Who in their right mind would sleep in their boss's bathroom? Firing Grace right then and there would be the logical, expected thing to do. He opened his mouth to call her out, to shout, to throw her out with the coldness that had made him feared in Raleigh, but then his eyes fell on one of the papers on the floor. It was a report, handwritten in shaky but legible letters, a thorough analysis of a mistake in a campaign by a client of Charlotte's, a mistake that could have cost millions, which no one on Daniel's elite team had noticed. Grace had not only identified it, but corrected it herself sometime between midnight and dawn. Daniel picked up the paper, his eyebrows furrowed, and read the next few lines. A brilliant solution, a contingency plan that would save the company's reputation. He looked at her again, now with a mixture of shock and fascination. That woman, slumped over the vase like a beggar, was a diamond in the rough, a strength hidden beneath the exhaustion. Grace moved, mumbling something incoherent, and almost fell over. Daniel took an instinctive step forward but stopped. His heart was beating fast, a strange and dangerous sensation he hadn't felt for years. Anger? No. Curiosity? Maybe. Or something deeper, something he didn't dare name. He dropped the report, the paper floating to the floor like a feather, and took a deep breath. Resignation was no longer an option. Grace Simons had just changed everything, and she didn't even know it yet. The tension in the air was palpable, a taut thread that could snap at any moment. Daniel turned around, his face a mask of control, but his eyes betrayed the inner turmoil. He left the bathroom without saying a word, leaving Grace there. What came next would not only be a test for her, but a turning point in his life, a free fall that neither of them could have predicted. Grace Simons woke with a jolt, her neck stiff, her mouth dry as sand. The icy marble of the VIP suite's bathroom pressed against her cheek, and the strong smell of disinfectant invaded her nostrils, mixed with the eucalyptus she herself had turned on hours before. For a second, she didn't know where she was. Then reality hit her like a punch. She had fallen asleep at work, in the boss's bathroom, the most sacred and untouchable place in Mulroney Advertising. Panic exploded in her chest. She got up too quickly, stumbling over the scattered papers, her heart racing as she tried to remember how she got there. The last thing she remembered was revising a report at 3 in the morning, her body screaming for rest, her eyes burning. "Just 5 minutes," she muttered to herself, sitting down on the pot to rub her temples. 5 minutes turned into hours. At 26, Grace was a survivor, but not the kind who flaunted scars with pride. She was born in Goldsboro, a forgotten little town an hour from Raleigh, where the smell of damp earth and cheap gasoline permeated the air. Her childhood home was a dilapidated trailer with a patched roof and broken windows that her mother, Ruth, covered with plastic bags in the harsh winters. Ruth would clean offices at night, returning with calloused hands and deep-set eyes, while Grace's father, a man with a deep voice and empty promises, had disappeared when she was 10, taking what little hope remained. Grace had grown up with the weight of abandonment, vowing that she would get out of that hole, that she would be someone. Her heavy, drawling southern accent still escaped when she lost her composure, but in Raleigh she smothered it, molding herself for a world that didn't want her. Raleigh was a two-faced beast. On one side, the glass buildings of Fayetteville Street reflected progress, money, power, like the Mulroney Advertising Building, a steel and glass monster that dominated the city center. On the other, the tree-lined streets of Five Points, where Grace rented a tiny apartment with mold on the walls, were reminiscent of an older, crueler South. For her, the city was a minefield, full of suspicious looks and closed doors. She would arrive at work at 6 in the morning, carrying the black coffee that Daniel demanded, reviewing contracts that the team's experts screwed up, putting out fires that no one else saw. She was invisible, but indispensable, a shadow that kept the machine running while the others took the credit. On that fateful day, the chaos had started early. A client of Charlotte's had threatened to break a 7-figure contract because of a mistake in the campaign, a mistake the creative team had ignored. Grace had spent the morning on the phone, soothing the client with promises she could barely keep, then rewriting the pitch herself, her fingers trembling on the keyboard. In the afternoon, a delay in a shipment to New York had her running between departments, shouting at suppliers while colleagues laughed behind her back. And then came the final request, to prepare the VIP suite for Daniel. She had scrubbed every surface, lined up every detail, until exhaustion engulfed her. The bathroom, with its promise of silence, had been her last refuge. Daniel Mulroney, on the other hand, was Grace's opposite in every way. At 38, he was the Prince of Raleigh, the son of an Asheville family that had built its fortune on timber and real estate. Tall, with broad shoulders and green eyes that pierced like knives, he ran Mulroney Advertising with a mixture of charm and brutality. His office at the top of the building was a throne decorated with modern art and trophies from industry awards. The gossip columns adored him, speculating about his affairs with models and heiresses, but no one saw him falter. He was pure steel, or so he believed. When Grace dragged herself out of the bathroom, papers clutched to her chest like shields. She didn't know Daniel was watching her. She didn't feel the weight of his eyes, the heat of a decision already taking shape in his mind. She just wanted to survive the day, the next shift, the next humiliation. But fate, cruel and capricious, was about to turn her inside out. Grace Simons, the girl from Goldsboro who fought against the world, was one step away from being noticed, and it would destroy her before it saved her. Grace Simons woke up on the sofa in the waiting room of Mulroney Advertising, the cold leather sticking to her sweaty skin. Over her, Daniel Mulroney's jacket, smelling of expensive cologne and power, covered her body like a shroud. The dawn light cut through the blinds, casting golden stripes on the beige carpet, and the distant hum of traffic in Raleigh echoed through the window. She sat, her heart in her throat, her brown hair sticking to her face as she tried to remember how she got there. Then she saw Daniel. He was on the other side of the glass table, arms crossed, a steaming cup of coffee in his hand. His green eyes pierced her, and a crooked smile played on his lips. "You snore like a tractor," he said, his voice low, dry, but with a dangerous glint that made Grace cringe. She opened her mouth to apologize, the words stumbling out in a panic. "I'm sorry, Mr. Mulroney. I didn't mean to." But he cut her off, throwing a white envelope on the table with a slap that echoed in the silence. "Cologne, Germany. Marketing event. You're coming with me. We leave in 3 days." Grace blinked, the floor seeming to collapse beneath her. An international trip. She who had never left North Carolina, who barely had a passport tucked away in a dusty drawer. Her stomach churned, a mixture of fear and disbelief. "But I'm not qualified," she stammered, her hands shaking. Daniel tilted his head, his gaze steady. "You saved my company yesterday. That's qualification enough." There was no room for refusal. He turned and left, leaving her alone with the envelope and an uncertain future. The next few days in Raleigh were a silent hell. In Mulroney's corridors, whispers followed her like shadows. "The sleeper who worked her way up," sneered colleagues, their voices cutting as Grace walked past with her head down, carrying folders and swallowing her shame. She worked even harder, revising every detail of the trip, but the weight of the stairs crushed her. At home, in the damp apartment in 5 Points, she stared at the cracked ceiling at night, her heart racing. "Why did he choose me?" she thought, remembering Goldsboro, the years of hunger, her exhausted mother. It was a chance, but also a trap, and Grace knew that Daniel Mulroney's world didn't forgive intruders like her. Cologne was a shock. The castle on the banks of the Rhine rose like a stone giant, its dark towers cutting through the grey sky while the river flowed lazily in the background. The marketing event brought together the global elite, men in expensive suits, women with jewelry that shone like beacons, all speaking in confident tones about millions and trends. Grace, in a simple black dress bought on sale at Nordstrom Rack, felt like a walking mistake. Her low-heeled shoes, worn to the soles, creaked on the marble floor, and she held a glass of water so tightly that her fingers ached, trying not to knock anything over. It was on the first night that Barbara Hensley arrived on the scene. Blonde, tall, in a red dress that screamed wealth, she crossed the room like a queen, her blue eyes fixed on Daniel, who was talking to executives near the fireplace. Barbara was from Charleston, heiress to a textile fortune, and had been around Daniel for years, an elegant predator with a venomous smile. When she saw Grace next to him, her gaze turned to ice. "So you're the assistant who fainted in the bathroom," she said, her voice too sweet, holding up a glass of champagne as the surrounding crowd fell silent, curious. Grace felt her face burn, her southern accent threatening to escape. "And you're the one who doesn't know what it's like to work for something," she retorted, her fists clenched, her heart thundering. Barbara laughed, a crystal-clear, cruel sound, but her eyes sparked with hatred. "Careful, darling," she whispered, leaning close. "This world isn't for you." The tension exploded over the next few days. During a dinner party, Barbara accidentally spilled red wine on Grace's dress, laughing as she ran to the bathroom, tears stinging her eyes. In the corridors, gossip about Grace, "She's only here out of pity," echoed, planted by Barbara and her allies. Grace struggled to prove her worth, correcting mistakes in presentations, suggesting ideas that made Daniel's eyes light up, but every victory came at a cost. She barely slept, the nightmares mixing Goldsboro with the castle, Barbara's face laughing above her, and then there was Daniel, his gaze too long, his hands brushing hers as he passed papers, a warmth that confused and terrified her. Something was growing between them, something dangerous, and Grace knew she was on the edge of an abyss. The rain fell in thick curtains over Cologne, hitting the castle's tall windows and turning the Rhine into a black, churning mirror. Grace Simons stood on the balcony of the West Wing, her drenched black dress clinging to her slim body, her brown hair dripping as she shivered in the biting wind. Hot tears mingled with the icy water on her face, her fists clenched against the stone parapet as sobs tore from her throat. Hours earlier, during a panel in the main hall, she had saved Daniel from disaster. He was presenting a campaign for a German client, but the data was wrong. A mistake that could have sunk Mulroney Advertising's reputation. Grace, sitting in the back row, had stood up on an impulse, interrupting him in a shaky but firm voice, correcting the figures in front of 100 incredulous executives. The silence that followed was deafening, until hesitant applause echoed. Daniel stared at her, his green eyes shining with something new, admiration, perhaps more. But the triumph was short-lived. Barbara Hensley had counterattacked with pure venom. The next morning, doctored photos circulated among the participants. Grace laughing with other executives, the angle suggesting flirtation, intimacy. Alongside this, an anonymous article in the local press called her the toilet opportunist, insinuating that she had seduced Daniel in order to get ahead in life. The humiliation burned like acid. Grace had heard muffled laughter at breakfast, felt sharp looks as she crossed the hall. She wanted to run, to go back to Raleigh, to hide in the hole she had come from. It was then that Daniel found her on the balcony, her suit drenched, her brown hair sticking to her forehead. "Why me? Why did you bring me here?" she shouted, her voice hoarse, her southern accent escaping in her fury. The wind howled around her, as if echoing her pain. Daniel stood still, the rain pouring down his face, his fists clenched at his sides. "Because you're better than all of them," he said, his voice firm but heavy, his eyes fixed on hers. "And I'm tired of pretending I don't see it." He stepped forward hesitantly, then grabbed her by the shoulders, pulling her into a desperate kiss. His lips were hot against hers, salty from the rain and tears, a clash of anger, desire, and fear. Grace responded for a moment, her body yielding to that forbidden heat, but then she pushed him away, stumbling backwards, her chest heaving. "This is crazy," she whispered, her eyes wide. Daniel stared at her, panting, but said nothing. The first turning point was sealed. A line had been crossed, and there was no turning back. Back in Raleigh, hell came alive. The Cologne scandal had exploded in the local press, headlines screaming, "The Bathroom Fortune Hunter," in bold letters. Grace arrived at work to hostile stares, her colleagues whispering in the corridors as she carried folders with trembling hands. Someone had thrown her reports in the garbage can, locked the meeting room before a presentation, leaving her outside while laughter echoed inside. She swallowed back tears, her teeth digging into her lip until it bled, but the pain was a reminder she didn't belong there. At home, in the apartment in 5 Points, she stared at the cracked mirror, the reflection of a Goldsboro girl who had dared to dream too big. "I can't take it anymore," she murmured, her voice broken as images of Daniel's kiss swirled in her mind, a torment that both warmed and destroyed her. Then Barbara appeared. On a grey evening she entered Mulroney, advertising like a storm, her emerald green dress shining, her heels echoing on the marble floor. She walked over to Daniel's desk, pretending to comfort him with a touch on the shoulder, but Grace heard the venomous whispers. "She's a burden, Daniel. She's dragging you down." The tension reached a new peak when Grace found an email in her inbox. Fake, but devastating. Signed with her name, it suggested that she was negotiating clients with a competitor in Durham. The sender was anonymous, but Barbara's scent was everywhere. Grace rushed into Daniel's office, the printed document trembling in her hands, her eyes wide with dread. "I didn't do it," she shouted, her voice failing. He stared at her, his jaw clenched, his eyes cold. "Then prove it," he said, low, almost cruel. The dismissal hung in the air like a guillotine, and Grace felt the floor collapse. The second turning point had hit her hard. She was alone, betrayed, on the verge of collapse, and the man who had kissed her was now her judge. The conference room at Mulroney Advertising was stifling, the air heavy with the smell of cold coffee and electrical tension. The glass walls reflected the Raleigh skyline, the tall buildings cutting through the grey late-afternoon sky, while the low sun cast harsh shadows on the oval mahogany table. Daniel Mulroney had summoned the entire team, 30 employees, from interns to senior managers, for an emergency meeting, and the nervous murmur filled the space like the hum of a swarm. Grace Simons entered last, her heart beating so hard it seemed to explode in her chest. Her grey uniform was rumpled, her brown hair tied back in a loose bun, her eyes deep from sleepless nights. She carried a briefcase against her chest like a shield, but her hands were shaking, the paper from the fake email, the one accusing her of betrayal, still burning in her memory. Daniel stood at the head of the table, his navy blue suit impeccable, his shoulders straight, his green eyes sparkling with an intensity that made the air vibrate. Next to him, Barbara Hensley flashed a triumphant smile, her red dress standing out like fresh blood against the dull grey of the room. She crossed her arms, her painted nails glistening, her gaze fixed on Grace like a predator about to strike. The team fell silent when Daniel slammed his palm on the table, the sound echoing like thunder. "Silence," he ordered, his voice sharp, and everyone obeyed. Grace stood by the door, her knees weak, feeling every glance like a stab. She knew what was coming. Dismissal, public humiliation, the end of everything she had fought for. "Grace Simons," Daniel began, her name coming out like a hammer against metal. She held her breath, her eyes wide, waiting for the blow. But then he continued, and each word dropped like a bomb. "She's no longer my assistant, she's my partner." A collective gasp swept the room, heads turning in shock. Barbara blinked, her smile faltering, while Grace stood paralyzed, the floor swaying beneath her feet. Daniel picked up a tablet from the table and threw it down hard, the screen lighting up with emails, messages, screenshots. Irrefutable proof. "The leaks, the lies, the photos in Cologne," he said, his voice rising, charged with anger. "It all came from her." He pointed at Barbara, his eyes narrowed in fury. "Hensley manipulated every step to destroy Grace, to manipulate me. But it's over." The room erupted in murmurs, chairs creaking as bodies leaned forward, hungry for the drama. Barbara took a step back, her face pale, her lips trembling. "This is ridiculous, Daniel. You have no proof," she began, but he cut her off, his voice a growl. "I have everything. Traceable emails, witnesses, IP records. You're out, Barbara. Take your things and get out." She stammered, her eyes wide, but the weight of defeat crushed her. With a muffled scream, she turned and ran, her heels echoing in the corridor, leaving a stunned silence behind. Grace felt her legs give way, leaning against the wall as tears welled up in her eyes. The room spun, relief mixed with fear and disbelief. Daniel turned to her, his face softening, his eyes shining with something she dared not name. He crossed the room in strides, ignoring the stares of the team, and stopped in front of her. "I love you, Grace," he said, his voice low but firm, each syllable laden with weight. "Not out of pity, not by chance, because you're the only real person I've ever known." The air caught in her throat, the murmurs of the team disappearing in a distant hum. Then, in a move that drew gasps from the room, Daniel dropped to one knee, pulling a velvet box from his inside jacket pocket. The ring inside sparkled, a simple but blinding diamond. "Marry me," he said, his voice trembling for the first time, his eyes fixed on hers, pleading. Grace was speechless, her heart racing, the world reduced to that man in front of her. She thought of Goldsborough, the hungry nights, the bathroom where it all began. She thought of the humiliations, the betrayals, the kiss in the rain in Cologne. His love was a lifeline, but also a chain, and she had to decide. Tears streamed down her face, her southern accent escaping in a hoarse whisper. "Yes," she said, the word barely audible but enough. Daniel smiled, a broken and true smile, and slid the ring onto her trembling finger. The room erupted in hesitant applause, but Grace barely heard. She was lost in his eyes, in the weight of that choice, in the uncertain future that was now engulfing her. The climax had hit her like a train, and she knew nothing would ever be the same. Dusk embraced Umstead Park, in Raleigh, with a golden light that poured over the clearing like warm honey, dyeing the sky shades of orange and soft pink. The tall trees, with their canopies of oaks and pines, swayed in the warm breeze, carrying the sweet scent of wildflowers scattered across the verdant grass. Grace Simons, now Grace Mulroney, walked barefoot, her light white cotton dress flapping around her ankles, the hems dancing in the wind as she held a makeshift bouquet of daisies picked right there. Her brown hair fell loose in natural waves, framing her pale but radiant face, her brown eyes glistening with tears that she struggled to hold back. It was her wedding day, a moment she had never imagined possible, and every step towards the rustic wooden arch seemed like a dream about to fall apart. Daniel Mulroney was waiting for her, his body tall and firm under a light grey suit that contrasted with the dark green of the forest in the background. His brown hair, normally neatly combed, was slightly mussed by the wind, and his green eyes, so sharp in the days of corporate battles, were now soft, vulnerable, fixed on her as if she were the center of the universe. When Grace reached his side, he took her trembling hands, his thumbs tracing gentle circles over her knuckles. "You are my home," he whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion, and the tears she had been holding back finally fell, running down her cheeks as the pastor began the ceremony. It was simple, unostentatious, just a few friends, the sound of a nearby stream and birdsong as witnesses. They exchanged handwritten vows, promises of support and love that echoed the struggles they had faced together, and when Daniel kissed her, a warm, firm kiss under discreet applause, Grace felt the weight of the world melt away. The following months were a delicate dance between victory and scars. The Raleigh press didn't give up easily, the headlines still revolving around the assistant who won over the CEO. But Grace and Daniel faced the gossip hand in hand. At Mulroney Advertising, she had taken on the role of partner, leading campaigns with a vision that left even her critics stunned. Her once hostile colleagues now respected her, some out of genuine admiration, others out of fear of Daniel. But Grace didn't care. She had proved her worth not just to them, but to herself. In the evenings, at her North Hills home, a red brick mansion with tall windows and a rose garden she had planted with her own hands, Grace would sit on the veranda, her diamond ring sparkling in the moonlight, and reflect on the tortuous path that had brought her there. Goldsboro came back in vivid flashes, the freezing trailer, her mother cleaning offices until she collapsed, her father who had abandoned her when she was 10. "I escaped," she murmured, her southern accent escaping in a whisper, and the wind seemed to respond, carrying her words away. A year later, life took another turn. Grace woke up one spring morning with a strange feeling in her stomach, a mixture of nausea and heat that made her run to the bathroom. The pharmacy test, bought in secret at a drugstore in 5 Points, confirmed it. She was pregnant. Sitting on the balcony that afternoon, the sun warming her face, she held the test in trembling hands, her heart racing as she waited for Daniel to come home from work. When he arrived, his jacket slung over his shoulder, his tired smile turned to shock when he saw the look on her face. "You're going to be a father," she said, her voice breaking, and Daniel fell to his knees in front of her, his eyes watering as he pressed his face against her still flat belly. "We're going to be a family," he whispered, his big hands wrapping around hers, and Grace cried, not from sadness but from a happiness so great that it seemed to hurt. Months later, sitting on the same balcony, now with a rounded belly under a loose dress, Grace felt the baby kick, a firm movement that made her laugh between tears. Daniel was beside her, a cup of coffee in his hand, his eyes shining as they planned for the future. A room painted yellow, a wooden crib, a life beyond the prejudices that had almost destroyed them. She thought of Cologne, the rain, and the kiss that had brought them together, of Raleigh, the gossip and the battles they had won. Their love had defied class, overcome Barbara's poison and the world's evil eye. Grace had suffered, bled inside, but there, with Daniel and the son she was carrying, she knew it had been worth it. Talent and determination had lifted her from the ashes of Goldsboro, and true love had transformed her. Fate had finally given them a new chapter, a beginning, not an end. I appreciate you sharing this moment with us. Every story I tell is crafted with dedication and care, with a view to touching the hearts of those who hear it. If this narrative has awakened something in you, please consider signing up so that we can continue together on this journey of telling stories that move. Your support is essential if we are to continue sharing these unique experiences. Cheers, and we'll see you in the next story.